He woke before the sun, as he always did, not because he wanted to, but because sleep no longer stayed with him for long. The ranch was quiet in a way that felt heavier than the dark sky above it. The wind moved slowly across the open land, brushing against tall grass and worn fences. The house stood still behind him, but he did not look back at it. He stepped outside and breathed in the cold morning air. It felt sharp in his chest, but he welcomed it because it reminded him he was still Heartha. Land had once felt full of sound and purpose, cows lowing in the distance, boots moving across dirt doors, opening and closing, voices calling out from one place to another. The sounds were fewer and softer. The ranch seemed to be holding its breath. The barn stood at the edge of the field, its shape dark against the pale sky. It had been there longer than anyone could remember. Strong beams, weathered boards, and a roof that had survived countless storms. It was the heart of the ranch, and also the place he had been avoiding. He walked past it every morning, keeping his eyes forward as if it were just another building. But it was not just wood and nails. It carried memories he was not ready to face. Inside it were echoes of laughter shared, work done side by side, plans spoken out loud without fear of tomorrow. Those memories followed him even when he tried to leave them behind. He moved through his chores, slowly feeding the animals, checking fences, fixing what needed fixing. His hands knew the work even when his mind wandered. There were moments when he forgot himself, when the rhythm of the day took over. But those moments never lasted long. A smell, a sound, a familiar sight would pull him back into the ache he carried people in. Nearby towns had noticed the change. They used to see him standing tall, riding into town with a steady look and a quick nod. Now when he came at all, his shoulders were lower, his eyes distant. Some tried to speak to him, offering kind words or simple greetings. He answered when he had to, but he did not stay long. He did not trust his voice to hold steady for too many words, though. Loss had come quietly at first, like a shadow stretching across the land. It was not sudden in the way storms can be sudden. It was slow and painful, leaving space where a presence used to be. Every corner of the ranch reminded him of that space. The kitchen table with one chair left unused, the porch where evenings were once shared, the barn where the days had always begun and ended together. The barn was the hardest to face. He had built much of his life around it. Repairs, upgrades, small changes made over the years. Each mark on the wood told a story of effort and care. There were times when he stood at a distance looking at it, his chest tightening, as if the building itself were watching him. Waiting on this morning, he stopped longer than usual. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint light across the field. The barn roof caught the first glow, and for a brief moment it looked almost warm and alive. The sight stirred something in him, a mix of longing and pain. He clenched his hands and turned away, telling himself he would deal with it another day. Returned to the house and sat at the table with a cup of coffee that grew cold in his hands. He did not drink much of it. He stared at the wall where a calendar still hung untouched. The days crossed off, stopped months ago. Time had lost its shape. Since the loss, there was no reason to mark it. Any more memories came without warning. He remembered mornings filled with easy talk and shared silence. Even hard days felt lighter when they were faced together now. The quiet pressed in on him, making every small sound seem louder, the ticking of an old clock, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floor under his boots. Each sound reminded him that he was alone. He stood up, pushed the chair back, and walked outside again. The day had fully begun now. The animals waited for him, and he did not want to keep them waiting. They depended on him, and that responsibility was one of the few things that still grounded him. He told himself that as long as he kept moving, the pain would stay manageable. As he worked, he found himself near the barn. Without meaning to, he stopped just outside the door. The wood was rough beneath his fingers when he touched it. He had not done that in weeks, maybe longer. He could not remember. The door had always been left open. Before now it stayed closed more often than not, as if closing it might keep the memories inside. He rested his forehead against the door and closed his eyes. The smell of hay dust and old wood drifted out even without opening it. That smell carried him back to better days, when the barn was full of voices and movement. He felt a tightness in his throat and stepped back quickly, not wanting to lose control. Turned and walked away again, his boots moving faster. This time he did not want to break down in the open field, where anyone might see, even though no one was around. Pride and habit kept him upright even when his heart felt heavy. The rest of the day passed. Slowly clouds moved in and out. Casting shadows over the land, he fixed a loose fence post, replaced a broken latch, and checked the water troughs. Each task gave him a reason to keep going. By afternoon, his body was tired, but his mind remained restless. As evening approached, the lights softened and the air cooled. He stood near the edge of the field watching. The sun lowered toward the horizon. The barn stood between him and the fading light, its outline sharp and familiar. For the first time in a long while, he did not turn away immediately. He simply stood there, letting the sight settle in him. He thought about how the barn had always been a place of work and shelter, but also of trust and shared effort. It had held laughter, arguments, plans, and promises. It had witnessed joy and struggle without judgment. Maybe that was why avoiding it felt like avoiding a part of himself. Night came quietly. The stars began to appear. One by one, he headed back to the house, knowing sleep would again be hard to find. As he reached the porch, he looked back once more at the barn. The door remained closed, but he felt a pull toward it stronger than before. Inside the house, he moved through his routine with care, locking doors, washing his hands, setting things in their place. He sat on the bed, staring at the floor, his thoughts circling around the same memories. He knew the barn would not stay untouched forever. Winter was coming, and repairs would need to be made. Avoiding it could only last so long. As he lay down, he listened to the sounds of the night wind in the trees, distant animal calls, the steady rhythm of the land breathing around him. These sounds had once brought comfort. Now they felt like reminders of what he had lost. Still beneath the pain, there was something else, a quiet sense that the land and the barn were waiting not to hurt him, but to help him remember, and maybe in time to heal. He woke again before the first light of day. His body moved out of habit more than willpower. The cold air pressed against his skin, and he shivered slightly, but kept walking across the yard toward the barn. He had tried to avoid it yesterday, but each morning it seemed to call him closer. The work he needed to do could wait, but the memories he carried could not. The barn looked the same as yesterday, rough boards weathered by years of sun and storms. Its presence was heavy in the field, as if it knew the weight he carried. He stood for a moment, taking in the sight of it. The way light caught the edges of the roof, and the long shadows stretched across the ground. The quiet stretched around him, holding him in place. He remembered the barn as it had been in better days. The mornings filled with activity, when animals were fed and chores were done together. The laughter that echoed off the beams, the simple words shared in the rhythm of work. Even arguments felt easier then, because they ended in smiles and shared understanding. Now those sounds were gone, leaving silence that pressed against him from every side. He stepped closer, running his hand along the door. The wood was rough under. His fingers splintered in places from years of work and weather. He remembered the times he had fixed those splinters with care, standing on a ladder or bending low to reach a broken plank. Each nail driven had felt like a small act of love toward the place and the people he had shared it with. Inside the barn, he could see the shadowed corners, dust motes drifting in the morning light that came through cracks in the roof. The smell of hay and wood and animals lingered in the air. Even though the space was empty, it still felt alive with memory. He walked slowly across the floor, feeling each step echo back to him like a heartbeat. He had not noticed in months. He paused by an old workbench cluttered with tools and scraps. The pieces of wood and metal told stories of projects begun and finished together. There were small carvings in the beams, a mark here, a scratch there, that reminded him of laughter and arguments and shared effort. He touched them lightly, almost afraid the contact would make them vanish forever. The barn held more than just tools and memories. It held a sense of him when he was younger and more confident. When life seemed simpler, even though it was full of hard work, the walls had watched him grow and change, and they knew the weight of what he carried now. Even the shadows seemed to hold understanding and patience. Moved toward the hayloft, climbing the ladder slowly. His hands gripped the wood carefully, as if it could break under him. The loft was dusty and quiet, but it held items stored long ago: a forgotten blanket, a cracked bucket, old boxes tied with string. Each object brought a memory with it, moments that had seemed ordinary at the time, but now felt like treasures. He stopped when he found a small crate tucked in the corner. Inside were letters and papers stacked neatly, as if waiting for him. They were not his letters, but letters that had passed through these hands once. Long ago, He picked one up carefully. The paper fragile under his fingers, he hesitated, unsure if opening it was the right thing. It was not addressed to him, but it felt like it had been waiting for him. Set the letter down and walked across the barn to the far wall, looking out through the wide-open doors. He could see the land stretching beyond the fence, past the fields where the cows had once grazed. He remembered walking those fields together, counting animals, planning repairs, and sharing stories. Even now the land seemed to stretch with him like a quiet companion, holding him steady. The sun was higher now, and light filled more of the barn. It revealed nails sticking out of boards and holes in the roof. He ran his hands along them, noting what needed repair each problem. Felt heavier because it was more than maintenance. It was a reminder that life went on, even when he had stopped noticing it. He could fix the barn, or he could ignore it, but he could not ignore time. He sat for a moment on an old hay bale watching. Dust flowed in beams of sunlight. He thought about the years that had passed since the barn was new. The long hours spent working side by side, the small victories and frustrations. The way hands and voices had moved together in a rhythm that felt like home. The memory was warm and painful at the same time. A sound outside made him look up. A bird landed on the fence just beyond the barn. Its small presence reminded him that the world continued in its quiet way. The bird did not know grief, and it did not care, but it lived fully in the moment. He envied it, and also felt comforted by it. There was a sense that life was moving forward, even for him. He walked to the center of the barn and stood, still closing his eyes, letting the memories wash over him. The place was quiet, yet it felt full of life in its own way. Every creak of the wood, every draft of wind seemed to speak to him. His grief was not lessened, but it felt like it had room to breathe. He realized he could be here with the memories. Without being consumed by them, he opened his eyes and walked toward the old tack room. The space smelled of leather and dust and polish. He remembered brushing saddles and hanging reins, each movement accompanied by words and laughter. Now he moved, slowly touching each object gently, remembering what it had meant. He did not rush the moment, because rushing could not make it easier. Outside the barn, the day moved on. Birds flew across the sky, and clouds shifted slowly in the afternoon light. The wind carried the smell of grass and earth and the faint scent of distant rain. The ranch itself seemed to settle into a rhythm that he had long ignored. The land and the barn held their quiet patience, waiting for him to notice. He sat again on a hay bale in the center of the barn, letting the afternoon pass slowly. He could hear the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the rafters and the soft hum of insects in the corners. The small movements and sounds reminded him that the barn was still alive, and that he was still alive too. The realization brought a quiet comfort he had not felt in weeks. He thought about the people who had shared the barn with him, how they had filled it with life and energy, even though they were gone. The barn held traces of them in the wood and the smell and the small marks they left behind. It was not just a building, it was a living memory that he could touch and feel and remember. He rose slowly, brushing his hands on his pants, and walked toward the door. The sun had lowered toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the floor. The barn seemed to glow in the warm light, and he felt a pull in his chest as he looked at it. The memories were not gone, and neither was the pain, but there was a sense that he could face it a little more each day. He stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind him. The sound echoed in the quiet field, and he paused, listening to it. The barn was still there, waiting for him, and he felt a strange sense of reassurance. The day was ending, and he had spent hours inside facing what he had avoided, and he realized that he had not fallen apart. He had simply remembered walking back toward the house. He looked once more at the barn in the fading light. It was still a heavy presence in the field, but it was not threatening. It was a part of the land and a part of him. He understood that avoiding it had not helped, and facing it slowly could be a way to begin. Again he reached the porch and paused. Feeling the cool evening air on his face, he sat quietly, listening to the wind moving through the trees and the distant lowing of cows. The land felt alive again, even in its quiet way, and he felt a sense of connection he had not allowed himself to feel in months. Night came with soft darkness. He moved inside and prepared for bed, the motions slow and careful. Each movement carried a sense of purpose, even if small. The day had passed, and he had been present for it in a way he had not been. For weeks he lay down, listening to the quiet house and thinking of the barn and the memories inside. I've realized that grief had made him avoid more than just the barn. It had made him avoid the land and the tasks, and even himself. But today he had faced a part of it and had come through without breaking completely. The barn had not changed, but he had changed a little. And that gave him hope for the days to come. The memories would return, and the sadness would stay. But he understood now that he could carry it all. He could be present for his grief without letting it consume him. The barn had shown him that even in stillness there could be life, and even in absence there could be memories. He closed his eyes, sleep came slowly, but it was lighter than before. He thought of the barn, the work, the land, and the memories, and felt a quiet sense that tomorrow he could walk back inside and face it. Again he understood that facing the past was not weakness, and that each day brought a chance to reconnect with the life he had built and the people he had loved. Night deepened, and he drifted into rest, knowing that the barn would wait for him, as it always had, ready to hold his memories and his quiet steps toward healing. Woke with the first light brushing the edges of the fields, he stayed lying on the bed for a while, letting the cold seep through the open window. He knew he could not stay in the house all day. The barn waited, and the land needed attention, but something else stirred inside him to a sense that he could not ignore any longer. He dressed slowly, pulling on worn boots and a jacket that smelled faintly of leather and earth. The air outside was crisp and smelled of frost and damp grass. He stepped out and paused, taking a deep breath, feeling the chill in his lungs and the sun touching the horizon. The ranch stretched before him, quiet and familiar, yet full of echoes from the past. Barn was closer now, in his line of sight. Each step toward it felt heavier than the last. The door looked the same, but this time there was no hesitation. He stopped just before it, his hand hovering over the latch. It had been weeks since he had entered purposefully. He could hear his own heartbeat in the quiet rustle of wind moving through cracks in the wood. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell of hay and old wood greeted him immediately. Dust floated in the sunlight, streaming through the small gaps in the roof. He looked around slowly, taking in the details. The workbench still cluttered the old tack room. The shadows along the walls, all of it seemed unchanged, yet somehow different. It felt as if the barn was waiting for him. He walked deeper into the space, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer light. The floorboards creaked under his weight, reminding him of the countless times he had moved across them before. Each sound seemed louder than it should have been, as if the barn itself was listening. He reached the center and stood still, feeling the space wrap around him like a protective presence. Thoughts drifted to all the times he had avoided this place, to the moments when he had told himself he could not face the memories. Inside these walls were traces of laughter. In arguments, shared work, and quiet evenings, he had carried the pain of loss outside, but inside it was all concentrated in the wood. In dust, he moved toward the workbench again. Picking up tools and brushing off old sawdust, the motions felt automatic, yet comforting. Each tool told a story of hands that had worked here before. Each mark in the wood reminded him of a conversation, a joke, a promise kept or broken. He ran his fingers over a carved line, tracing the memory with care. His attention turned to the corners of the barn, where old boxes and crates sat tucked away. He knelt to examine them one by one. Some held nails and screws long forgotten. Others held items that belonged to the past, pieces of cloth, a worn hat, a small leather pouch each. One brought a flicker of memory, making him pause to remember. He opened a crate that had been tucked in the far corner. The wood was splintered and the lid felt heavy in his hands. Inside were letters and papers tied with string. Some were bills and receipts, but a few were personal notes. He pulled one gently, feeling the paper fragile beneath his fingers. He hesitated, but curiosity pulled him closer. The letter was folded neatly, the ink faded, but the words were still clear. He recognized the handwriting in a way that made his chest tighten. It was not addressed to him yet. It felt as though it had been waiting for him to find it. He considered setting it aside, but something inside told him to read it slowly and carefully. He sat on a hay bale, opening the letter with care. The words spoke of thoughts left unspoken, of small fears and small joys, of moments that seemed ordinary but now carried meaning. Each sentence made him pause, letting the feelings settle in him. He realized that the writer had trusted someone else with thoughts they had never shared. A loud tears pricked his eyes, but he blinked them. Away, keeping his focus on the words, each paragraph revealed more of the life inside the barn, the routines, and the shared work, the care taken in small gestures, and the affection that had been unspoken. Yet the letter also spoke of regrets, of misunderstandings that had never been resolved, and of things the writer had hoped would never be discovered. He folded the letter slowly, holding it against his chest for a moment before putting it back in the crate. The emotions it stirred were raw and deep, but there was also a sense of understanding forming inside him. He had avoided this place because it reminded him of absence, but now it was reminding him of presence. Two presence in small acts. Presence in shared moments that had not been fully lost. He stood and walked across the barn, running his hands along the walls, feeling the texture of the wood, remembering each repair, each nail driven, each mark told a story, and he could feel the history beneath his fingertips. The barn was more than a building. It was a witness to life and to loss and to the quiet passage of time he moved toward. The loft, climbing the ladder slowly, each step creaked under his weight, and he paused, feeling the motion beneath him. The loft held boxes and blankets and tools left untouched for months. He pulled aside one of the old crates, uncovering a small tin box. The box was locked with a simple clasp, but it opened easily under his fingers. Inside were photographs, faded and curling at the edges. He took out each photograph, slowly examining the faces and places he remembered, the moments captured, the smiles, the work, the quiet afternoons. The images were frozen in time, but they carried the weight of emotion. He held them gently, feeling the connection that had never truly disappeared. The afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the floor of the barn. He set the photographs back carefully and sat on the loft edge, looking down at the space below. The barn seemed alive in a quiet way. It had always been alive, but he had never noticed it so fully. Each sound, each shadow, each scent carried a story, and he was beginning to hear them. He thought about the work that needed to be done, repairs to the roof, the fences, the doors. It all seemed overwhelming when he thought of it as chores, but when he looked around, he realized that each small act of care would honor the space and the memories within it. He could fix the barn not to erase the past, but to carry it forward. He descended the ladder slowly and walked across the floor to the door, the light from outside spilled and warming. The space, he paused, listening to the quiet hum of the barn, the shifting of the air through the boards, the small movements that marked it as alive. Each sound reminded him that he was part of it, and it was part of him outside the wind had picked up, moving across the fields, stirring the tall grass. He took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs, feeling alive and tired at the same time. He realized that he had been holding himself back, not because of fear, but because facing the memories was heavy work, and now the weight felt different. He looked back at the barn, letting the sunlight touch the edges of the roof. It stood as it always had, strong and quiet, waiting for the steps of someone who could care for it once more. He understood that the barn was more than wood and nails. It was a keeper of stories, and he was beginning to understand his place in them. He returned to the workbench, picking up nails and a hammer. The tasks ahead seemed smaller now, each one a way to honor what had come before. He worked slowly, tapping the nails into place, listening to the sound as it echoed through the space. The motions were comforting and grounding, each strike a reminder that action could heal even small parts of the hard hours past. Unnoticed as he worked, moving from one small repair to another, each movement carried a sense of purpose. The barn responding to care with stability and strength. He paused to rest, wiping sweat from his brow, and listening to the quiet all around him. It felt like a conversation without words, a connection that had waited for him to return. Evening approached. He stood in the center of the barn, looking at the repairs he had made. The space was still old and worn, but it had regained a small measure of strength. It would not stay perfect forever, but it was a start that mirrored something happening inside him as well. He stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind him. The sound carried across the yard, and he paused, listening to it. He realized that the barn had not only been waiting for him, it had been ready to remind him of what he could still do, what he could still feel. The day had been long and heavy, but it had been filled with presence walking across the field. He looked at the land stretching into the horizon. The colors of sunset painted the sky in muted shades, and he felt a quiet sense of peace. The barn would wait for him tomorrow, and he knew he would walk back inside, ready to continue facing what he had avoided. Night fell slowly, and he moved inside the house, preparing for rest. The motions were steady and careful, each one a reflection of the day spent in work and memory. He lay down, listening to the quiet settling over the ranch, the wind through the trees, and the distant hum of animals. As he drifted into sleep, he thought of the barn, the letters, the photographs, and the small repairs. Each piece held a story, a memory, a moment of life that had not disappeared even when he had avoided it. He understood now that facing the past did not mean being overwhelmed by it. It meant being present with it and letting it guide the steps forward. The night deepened, and he rested, knowing that tomorrow he would rise again and walk into the barn, carrying with him the memories and the small courage to meet them each step at a time. The barn waited, and he would not avoid it any longer. He woke to a morning that felt colder than usual. The sky was pale, and the wind moved across the fields in long, quiet gusts. He pulled on his jacket and boots and stepped outside. The barn waited at the edge of the field like it had every day, but today there was a pull in his chest he could not ignore. Knew he had to go inside and face more than the walls and the dust. The door was still weathered and strong as he pushed it open. The smell of hay and old wood drifted out, greeting him like an old companion. The light fell in through the gaps in the roof, illuminating the dust in the air. The space was familiar, yet it felt different today, more alive in its silence than he had ever noticed before. He walked toward the crate where he had found the letters before. His hands hovered over the top for a moment, as though sensing that what lay inside was not meant to be touched lightly. He pulled it toward him and opened it carefully. The letters were stacked in order, faded envelopes, tied with string. He picked one up slowly and felt the paper trembling slightly under his fingers. The words inside made him pause. They were not written for him yet. Reading them now felt as though the writer had been speaking directly to him. The letter spoke of regret, of choices that had been hidden, of feelings never shared. It told of moments when the writer had hoped no one would ever know the truth of what they felt inside. He sat down on a hay bale and read slowly, absorbing each line. The words were simple, yet heavy with meaning. They revealed a side of life he had not known, a side that had been kept safe even from him. The letter spoke of love and sorrow, of mistakes and hope, all wrapped together in handwriting that now seemed fragile, and human tears formed in his eyes, but he did not wipe them away. He let them fall freely, feeling the weight of all the things unspoken. The letter was a bridge to understanding things he had carried without knowing their source. The grief he had held on to so tightly began to shift into something softer, something that felt like acceptance. The barn around him seemed to respond to the quiet in the room. The dust motes floated gently in the sunbeams. The wood creaked softly with the movement of the wind. It was as if the barn itself had been waiting for him to hear these words and let them settle inside him. The silence was not empty. It was full of life and memory. He continued reading each letter in the crate, discovering more truths and small confessions that had never been spoken aloud. The writer had shared hopes and fears with someone they trusted completely, even though the letters had never been delivered. It was as if the letters had been meant to stay hidden, but now they were guiding him toward understanding. He held one letter close, letting the words sink into him. He realized that all the times he had avoided the barn were all the times he had avoided feeling these truths. These letters were a reminder that love and loss were complicated, and that grief did not have to be carried alone, even when it seemed so time passed unnoticed. As he moved through the letters, some made him smile faintly, others made his chest tighten. He traced the lines with his fingers, reading phrases over and over, letting the meaning settle slowly. The barn became a safe place to experience the emotions he had pushed aside for so long. He remembered the days when laughter had filled these walls, when voices had spoken freely, and even disagreements had ended with understanding. Though letters reminded him that those moments had been real, and that their essence had never left the barn. It had been waiting to remind him of what was possible again. He set one letter aside and stood walking slowly toward the loft. The steps creaked beneath him, and he paused to touch the railing, remembering the hands that had once leaned on it. He moved carefully, taking in the space around him, letting each memory arrive naturally, without forcing it. The barn had a rhythm, and he was beginning to move in it. The loft, he found an old tin box tucked behind some hay bales. He opened it and discovered photographs, worn and curling at the edges. They captured moments of shared work, small smiles, and quiet days. The images were a reflection of a life lived fully and lovingly. Even though some of those in the photographs were gone, the feeling in the pictures was still present. He held each photograph carefully, looking at the faces, at the hands, at the places they were frozen in time, but they spoke loudly to him of connection and trust. He felt a wave of both sadness and comfort as he realized that even though the people were no longer here, their presence was not entirely gone. Returning to the floor, he picked up the hammer and some nails. He decided to do small repairs, not to fix everything, but to honor what had been there. The motions grounded him, each strike of the hammer a quiet meditation on life and memory. The barn responded beneath his hands, sturdy and alive, reminding him that care could bring life back even to old wood. The afternoon sun moved across the floor, casting long lines of light. He paused to rest, sitting on a hay bale, and looked at the door where sunlight spilled in. He felt a quiet warmth in his chest from the combination of work, memory, and the words he had read. The barn was no longer a place to avoid. It was a place of encounter, a space where grief could meet understanding. He thought about the people who had shared this barn. The hands that had lifted and carried and built and repaired the letters gave voice to thoughts he had never known, and that voice now resonated inside him. He realized that even the things left unsaid had meaning and could teach him about love and life and loss. The shadows grew longer and the barn darkened slightly, but the warmth remained in his mind. He picked up more letters, reading slowly, absorbing the quiet wisdom they offered. He felt a connection that transcended absence, the presence of someone caring, even when they were not physically near. The wind outside shifted, carrying the smell of earth and distant rain. He stood listening to it for a while, feeling the connection between the barn and the land and himself. It was a subtle bond, but it was strong enough to give him courage. The letters had opened a door, and he was stepping through it carefully, feeling the strength to carry his grief differently. Moved from corner to corner, the hammer in hand, gently tapping repairs into place. Not everything was fixed, but each small act was a step toward reconciling the past with the present. Each stroke brought a quiet sense of order and purpose he had not felt in months. The barn was no longer just a shelter. It was becoming a place of living memory. Evening approached, and the light outside softened. He sat in the center of the barn, holding a photograph and a letter together, feeling the weight of loss and love and understanding. All at once he let himself breathe fully for the first time in weeks. Letting the barn and the words and the memories cradle him, he realized that the letter had done more than speak. It had given him permission to feel, to remember, and to move slowly toward healing. The barn was no longer a space to hide from. It was a space to live in it, to encounter the full range of emotions safely, and to carry the lessons forward. He carefully put the letters back in the crate and the photographs in the tin box, arranging them neatly so that they could wait for him to return. The barn held them like it held him steady, holding space for grief and memory and understanding. Like walking outside, he let the door close behind him, feeling the sound echo softly in the yard. The wind moved through the field, brushing past him. He looked at the barn and the fading light, feeling gratitude and connection. The structure was unchanged, but the meaning inside it had shifted profoundly. He walked back toward the house slowly, the sun dropping below the horizon, casting muted colors across the land. The ranch felt alive in a quiet way, even though the day was ending. He understood now that presence was more important than perfection, that facing the past could be gentle and still powerful. At the porch he paused, listening to the sound of the wind and the distant animals. The land was steady, the barn was steady, and he felt steadier too. Realized that grief could be met with care, that letters could be more than words. They could be guidance, and that the barn could be more than a building. It could be a space of transformation. Night settled over the ranch. He moved inside and prepared for bed, the motions slow and careful. Each act carried intention. Each movement carried the memory of the day spent facing what had been avoided. He lay down, listening to the quiet and thinking of the letters and the barn and the work he had done. As sleep came, he held the feeling of connection close, the sense that he was not alone even in absence. The barn would wait, and the letters would wait, and he would return, bringing his presence. His hands and his willingness to continue facing the past, one small step at a time. He drifted into rest, knowing that tomorrow he could rise and walk into the barn again. The space and the letters and the memories had opened a door for him, and he would walk through it, slowly letting grief and love meet and transform. In the quiet strength of the place he had once avoided, he woke before the sun had fully risen. The cold morning air greeted him as he stepped outside, and he pulled his jacket tighter around him. The ranch lay quiet in the pale light. The barn stood at the edge of the field, strong and patient, as if it had waited all night for him. He walked slowly toward it, each step measured, feeling the weight of yesterday in his legs and heart. When he reached the barn, he paused outside the door, letting his hand hover over the latch. The letters he had found and the small repairs he had done had opened something inside him, but there was more to do, more to face, more to understand. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, letting the familiar smells of hay and wood wrap around him. He walked across the floor of the barn, running his hands along the beams. The dust in the air shimmered in the morning light. Each creak of the floor beneath his boots sounded louder now in the quiet. He stopped in the center and closed his eyes, remembering the letters and photographs from the loft. They had shown him a side of life he had not known, and a side of grief he had not allowed himself to feel. He moved to the crate and carefully picked up a letter. He held it for a long moment before reading slowly. The words were simple, yet full of truth. They spoke of fear and hope, of love and misunderstanding, of things that had been hidden and things that had been wished for. They were not written for him. Yet each sentence felt personal, each phrase a quiet revelation. He sat on a hay bale, reading and rereading phrases that made him pause and take a deep breath. Some sentences brought tears that he did not wipe away. Some brought a faint smile he let the emotions come freely, letting them settle in him. He realized that the letters were a gift that allowed him to feel and remember and understand all at once. Hours passed unnoticed as he read through the letters. The barn was still around him, but he did not notice it in the same way as before. It was not just walls and roof. It was a place holding memory, holding presence, holding the quiet strength of the past. He traced the words on the paper with his fingers, feeling their meaning through touch and thought. He stood and walked toward the loft, climbing the ladder slowly. Each step creaked and echoed, but he welcomed the sound. It reminded him that he was moving through space and time, that each motion mattered and each memory counted. The loft held the photographs and small objects that had been left untouched for years. He took each photograph, carefully examining the faces and places. He remembered the shared moments and small gestures captured in the images. The photographs spoke of life lived fully, even in hard times, of joy that had once been taken for granted. He felt a quiet warmth in his chest, knowing that these moments had not disappeared. Even though they had faded from daily life. Returning to the floor, he picked up the hammer and nails again. He moved slowly, repairing small cracks in the wood, fixing boards that had loosened over time. Each motion was deliberate, each strike of the hammer a way of honoring the past while building for the present. The barn responded beneath his hands, sturdy and alive, reminding him that care could create strength even in worn places. He paused to look around, noticing the light shifting across the floor. The dust in the sunbeams glowed softly, and the barn felt alive with quiet energy. It was not the same as the laughter of the past, but it had its own rhythm, its own voice that spoke of endurance and presence. He breathed slowly, feeling himself part of it, part of the history and care it held. He moved to the tack room, brushing off dust and straightening old saddles and ropes. The motions were automatic, yet thoughtful. He remembered the times they had worked together here, sharing conversation and small moments of guidance and teaching. Even though those moments were gone, the memory remained alive in the space, and he felt connected to it again. As afternoon approached, he stopped to sit on a hay bale, holding a photograph and a letter, together feeling the weight of grief and love and understanding all at once. He let himself breathe fully, letting the emotions flow freely. The barn held him in a quiet embrace, a place where he could feel everything without fear or judgment. He thought about the life he had led and the loss he had carried. He understood now that grief was not something to be pushed away or ignored. It was something to encounter slowly and carefully, letting it move through him, letting it teach him about love and connection and memory. The barn had shown him this truth. He stood and moved toward the back of the barn, noticing small repairs that still needed attention. Each task seemed less daunting now, because he approached it with presence and purpose. Not with fear or avoidance, he worked slowly, tapping nails into place, fixing boards, sweeping dust. The motions grounded him and made him feel alive in a way he had not felt for months. Wind outside shifted, carrying the smell of earth and distant rain. He paused, listening to it, letting it fill his chest and mind with quiet energy. The barn and the land were alive around him, and he was part of that life again. Each sound, each scent, each small motion connected him to the world and to himself. Approached, and the sunlight turned soft and warm across the barn floor. He sat on a hay bale, listening to the quiet, noticing the way the shadows stretched and moved. The space felt full and alive, not just with memory, but with possibility. He realized that the barn could be more than a place of grief. It could be a space of healing and presence. Stood and walked slowly across the floor, letting his hands rest on the walls, feeling the texture of the wood, remembering the small repairs he had made and the letters he had read. Each touch was a connection to the past and a commitment to the present. He understood that healing did not erase memory. It embraced it and carried it forward. He moved to the loft one last time that day, pulling out the tin box with photographs and objects inside. He found small treasures, old and worn, but full of life. He held each item carefully, remembering the moments they represented and feeling gratitude for their presence. The objects were reminders that life and love and memory could endure, even in absence. Returning to the floor, he looked at the barn from the center, letting the quiet wash over him. The space had changed subtly through his work and presence. It felt alive and welcoming and patient. The barn was no longer a place to avoid. It was a place to be, a place to remember, a place to heal. He stepped outside, letting the door close gently behind him. The sun was setting, casting long, warm shadows across the field. The wind moved softly through the grass, and the air smelled of earth and approaching night. He looked at the barn one last time, feeling a quiet sense of peace, and walking toward the house, he noticed the land in a way he had not for months. The fields stretched into the horizon, the fences held steady, and the animals moved slowly and naturally. The ranch felt alive, and he felt alive within it. He understood that care, presence, and memory could transform even the heaviest grief into something gentle and sustaining. At the porch, he paused, listening to the sounds of the land, the wind, the distant lowing of animals, the creak of boards. The ranch and the barn had become more than buildings and fields. They were companions in his life, holding memory and presence and quiet strength. He felt gratitude for the barn and the letters and the small acts of repair and remembrance that had brought him here. Night settled over the ranch. He moved inside, preparing for rest, the motions slow and thoughtful. Each movement carried intention and presence. As he reflected on the day spent with memory and action, he lay down on the bed, listening to the quiet, holding the barn and letters and photographs in his mind, feeling connection and understanding. Sleep came. He held the feeling of presence and care close. The barn would wait, and the letters would wait, and he would return, carrying his presence, his hands, and his willingness to face the past and the memory and the grief slowly and fully. He understood that healing could be quiet and patient, and that love could endure beyond absence. Night deepened, and he drifted into rest, feeling a quiet certainty that tomorrow he could rise and walk into the barn again. He would continue the work of repairing wood and heart and memory, each small step a gift to himself and the space that had waited for him so long. The barn was no longer a place of avoidance. It was a space of encounter and hope, and he would meet it. There he woke slowly too. The faint light of morning spilling across the fields. The air was cold and sharp, and he pulled his jacket tighter around him before stepping outside. The ranch lay quiet beneath the pale sky, and the barn waited at the edge of the field, strong and patient. He felt a quiet resolve stirring inside him, something he had not felt in a long time. He walked toward the barn, each step measured and steady, The door looked the same, but he no longer felt hesitation. He reached it and paused, letting his hand hover over the latch. He breathed in the familiar smells of hay and wood and earth, and then pushed the door open. Stepping inside, the space greeted him with quiet warmth, dust floating in beams of sunlight. He moved slowly across the barn, letting his hands brush against the walls and beams. The floor creaked beneath his boots, the sound echoing gently around him. He stopped in the center and closed his eyes, feeling the presence of the past and the quiet strength of the space he remembered. The letters and photographs and repairs, and felt a small sense of completion, but also a sense that there was more to do. He went to the crate and pulled out the letters, one by one, reading them slowly again, letting the words sink deeper this time. Each phrase spoke of trust, hope, regret, and love. Each line carried a sense of honesty that he had not been able to see before. The letters were not addressed to him, but they had become a guide, a way to understand and accept the full range of human emotion. He paused, holding one letter to his chest, feeling the words resonate within him. He realized that grief and love and memory could coexist. The letters showed him that absence did not erase connection, that care and attention could transform even old pain into something gentle and sustaining. He felt a quiet gratitude for the words and the people who had written them. He stood and walked toward the loft, climbing the ladder slowly. Each step creaked beneath him, and he paused, feeling the motion under his hands. The loft held photographs and small objects that had been stored for years. He pulled each item carefully and looked at the faces and places captured in the images. The photographs spoke of moments, shared smiles, and work done together. Even though the people were gone, the essence of those moments remained alive. He set the photographs aside and picked up the hammer and nails again. Moving slowly, he began repairing boards and doors that had worn with time. Each strike of the hammer was deliberate, each motion a reflection of care and presence. He repaired boards, tightened loose hinges, swept dust from corners. The barn responded beneath his hands, sturdy and welcoming, a silent partner in his quiet work. The afternoon light moved across the barn floor, creating patterns of shadow and sun. He paused to sit on a hay bale, looking around the space. The dust motes floated in the sunbeams, and the wood glowed warmly in the light. He let the quiet settle over him, feeling the rhythm of the barn and of his own heartbeat aligning. He realized that this space could be more than a place of memory. It could be a place of healing and presence. He thought about the past and the loss he had carried so heavily. The letters and photographs had guided him to a deeper understanding that grief was not something to push away, but something to meet slowly and deliberately, letting it teach and shape him. He felt a sense of calm he had not known in months, a quiet acceptance of what had been lost and what remained. He moved from one corner of the barn to another, inspecting the repairs he had made. Small cracks had been filled, loose boards tightened. The space was not perfect, but it was cared for and alive in a quiet way. The motions grounded him, connecting him to the past and present, to memory and action. He realized that even small acts of care could transform a space and a heart outside. The wind moved across the field, carrying the faint smell of earth and grass. He stepped to the door, pausing to feel the breeze on his face. He looked out over the land, seeing the fences, the fields, the animals, and the horizon beyond. The ranch was alive in its quiet way, and he felt alive within it. He understood that presence and care could create meaning even when life felt heavy. He returned to the center of the barn, sitting on a hay bale, holding a photograph and a letter together, feeling the weight of loss and love and understanding. He let himself breathe deeply for the first time in a long while. The barn was holding him steady, a space where grief and memory and life could coexist in quiet harmony. The shadows lengthened and the sunlight softened. He stood, walking slowly to the tack room, brushing off dust and arranging saddles and ropes. The motions were automatic, yet thoughtful, he remembered. Days spent sharing work and conversation and care. Even though those days were gone, their essence remained in the objects and the space, and he felt connected once again. He paused to look around the barn, noticing small details he had not seen before. The beams bore marks of past repairs. The floor carried impressions of countless footsteps. Each nail had a story. The space was alive with history and memory, and it welcomed his presence as part of its ongoing story. He realized that connection could endure beyond absence. Evening approached and the light outside softened to muted shades of gold and orange. He sat in the center of the barn, listening to the quiet, feeling the rhythm of his own breath and the steady presence of the space. The barn was no longer a place of avoidance or sorrow. It was a place of encounter, a place of remembrance and presence and quiet hope. He stood and moved slowly across the floor, running his hands along the wood, feeling the texture and weight of each board. Each touch was a connection to the past, a commitment to the present. The barn had taught him that healing did not erase memory. It embraced it. It carried it forward. That care and attention and presence could transform grief into understanding. He climbed the loft one last time that day, pulling out the tin box with photographs and objects. Inside, he carefully handled each item, remembering the moments they represented, feeling gratitude for their presence. He arranged them neatly, knowing they were part of the barn's history and his own memory. He felt a sense of continuity, a quiet strength in preserving and honoring the paste. Returning to the floor, he looked around the barn from the center, letting the quiet wash over him. He could feel the changes wrought by his hands and presence. The space felt alive, welcoming, and patient. The barn had become more than a building. It had become a place of reflection and healing, and he had become a part of its story. Stepped outside, letting the door close gently behind him. The air was cooler now, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the field. He looked at the barn one last time, feeling gratitude and connection. The structure had not changed, but the meaning within it had shifted profoundly. And he felt a quiet sense of completion walking across the field toward the house. He noticed the land in a way he had not for months. The fences stretched steady, the animals moved slowly across the fields, and the grass swayed with the evening wind. The ranch felt alive, and he felt alive within it. He understood that presence and care could transform grief into something gentle and sustaining. At the porch, he paused, listening to the wind, the distant lowing of animals, the soft creak of boards. The land and barn were companions, holding memory and presence and quiet strength. He felt gratitude for the barn letters, photographs, and small acts of repair and remembrance that had brought him here. He understood that grief could be met with care, and that love and memory could endure. And night settled over the ranch. He moved inside, preparing for rest, the motions slow and thoughtful. Each act carried intention, reflecting the day spent with memory and action. He lay down, listening to the quiet, holding the barn letters and photographs in his mind, feeling connection and understanding. As sleep came, he held the feeling of presence and care close. The barn would wait, and the letters and photographs would wait. He would return, bringing his hands, presence, and willingness to continue facing the past and the memory and grief, slowly and fully. He understood that healing could be quiet, patient, and enduring, and that love could live beyond absence. The night deepened, and he drifted into rest, feeling a quiet certainty that tomorrow he could rise and walk into the barn again. The space, the letters, photographs, and memories had opened a door for him, and he would continue through it, slowly letting grief and love meet and transform. In the quiet strength of the place he had once feared, he dreamed lightly of the barn filled with sunlight and soft wind of letters and photographs of hands repairing wood and heart together. He felt the presence of the past and the quiet strength of continuity. Even in absence, there was life and connection. Even in loss, there was care and understanding. The barn was no longer a place of sorrow. It was a place of quiet hope, and he would meet it there again.